Plugin acceptance.
So, hi everyone. Who likes semantic versioning? Who hates this semantic versioning? Okay, and I see some people raise their hand at the same time, so that is a totally valid take on that. So let's dive into what we can do. So I work for Elastic, the company behind Elasticsearch. We also have sometimes struggles around semantic versioning, but it's not specifically about Elasticsearch, but more semantic versioning in general. So let's see. Semantic versioning itself is defined on SemVer.org, and as you can see, they are in version 2.00 already. So they are not using all the version levels they could use, but they actually made it to the second major version already because they themselves had a breaking change. If you've never seen SemVer before, the structure is generally major version, minor, and patch, or maybe the better naming would be break, add, fix, because that's the general idea. So the patch level version at the end is you fix something, but you don't add features, you don't break any APIs. The minor version number is you can add features, but you don't break anything. And the major version number is this is breaking something in the API. And that sounds very simple, right? So we are pretty much done with the talk. Not quite. It's unfortunately a bit more complicated, or you can make it complicated if you want to. These are all valid version numbers in SemVer. Does anybody know what is the lowest and the highest version number in this here? How they should be ordered? Any guesses? So the order is that the very first one is alpha. And then after that you have alpha dot whatever version number. So then you will have 2. Then you will have dot 11. Then you will have alpha dot beta. And then you would have beta. So that would be the right order in these version numbers. Is anybody using it like that? Good. I think you only do that if you hate your users. But you can do that to make it as a quiz. But this is also in the semantic versioning definition. They have defined that this is the right order of things. And you could make it complicated, but you don't have to. And one thing that seems to be very common on the internet is that somebody says, like, you're doing semantic versioning wrong. And like everything on Twitter or the internet, and people get very enraged. But semantic versioning and you're doing it wrong seems to be like a very common complaint or things that people take very personally. Because everybody thinks they are doing semantic versioning right or their interpretation is right. Why is that so complicated? So the first complication it normally starts at, because semantic versioning always talks about the API. And then the question is, what is even the API? So for example, depending on what interface you expose, if you have a REST interface, that's normally relatively straightforward. If you have a client, things get a bit more complicated, but platform, there it really gets muddy. So for example, if you change the supported JDK version, who thinks that's a breaking change? A few. Who thinks that's perfectly fine in any major or minor version? In any minor or patch level version. Okay, so also very few. So you can see based on these, it's kind of tricky, like what is even breaking, because some people will argue that if you need to upgrade the JDK, it's a breaking change because I need to change something in my system to keep that running on that version. And others will say like, oh, this is more of an implementation detail and the surface of things is too wide, so it doesn't even make sense to increment the major version all the time. And then there's the discussion about like internals, if internal dependencies might make a difference. Or for example, coming back to the Elasticsearch example, because that's close to my heart. For us, for example, the REST API is sacred. So if you break anything there, it's definitely a major version. But we also support something called plugins that you can install into Elasticsearch, and they basically expose pretty much the entire API surface within the Java application of Elasticsearch. And there we frequently have breaking changes because whenever we move a package or so, it would be a breaking change. And for us, those are not breaking changes. And sometimes people are very upset because their plugins don't work anymore because something changed. But for us, this is like internal, and they're not part of the API. But that's exactly the problem of what you even consider the API. Or, for example, can we drop Ubuntu 16.04, for example, in a minor version? Or would that be a breaking change again? So these things all lead to complicated discussions of what is the API and what is breaking and what is not breaking. And there is this great XKCD comic, you probably have seen that one, where somebody uses a bug when it heats up as a feature. And for 99% of the users or so, this is probably a fix, and it was never a feature in the first place. But for some people, this is a feature that they want to use. So the discussion of what is breaking and what is not breaking can be very complicated in any even medium complicated system, because what is a bug for some is not a bug for others. Then there is the big discussion about security fixes. Can you break security or because of security or maybe an unintended use? We have that sometimes in our products that people use it in an insecure way, and we never thought that you could use it like that in the first place. And then we kind of like fix the API, and for us, again, this is a fix. And for others, we are breaking their use. So that keeps complicating the discussion of like what is breaking and what is not breaking. For example, coming back to security and dependencies and everything, I guess everybody remembers the Log4j2 security issue. And for example, I just picked that to show like they support a lot of different JDK versions. And you can see they don't consider it a breaking change if you need a newer JDK version. But because of that, they also support like 3 minor versions basically, because they have 2.3 for Java 6, 2.12 for Java 7, and 2.17 right now for Java 8 and later. So for them, it's not a breaking change if you need a higher JDK version. On the other hand, I'm also not sure this is adding a lot of clarity or this is making your versioning a lot simpler if you do something like that. But that's the path they have picked on that. And of course, accidental changes happen because we always expect that open source happens something like this, that it's a lot of people collaborating and it's a big happy family. And oftentimes open source is more like somebody is sitting in their bedroom or attic or whatever and is coding away at night and might slip in an accidental API breaking change. So this is something that unfortunately happens every now and then. One of the weirder things I think in semantic versioning, or once you think about it, it's not so weird, that adding something is asymmetric. So if I add a new feature in, let's say, 2.3, if I figure out in 2.4 that this was a really bad idea and I want to get rid of it again, then it would be a major version because any removal would be a major version. So adding something is always kind of like cheap and easy to do, but once you figure out it was a bad idea and you want to revert that, then you are in a more complicated situation. Something that gives semantic versioning also a bad reputation, I think, is if you use version ranges, which is very uncommon in Java, but recommended, for example, in the NPM world. Is anybody using version ranges there? Some people, okay. So I think why NPM, for example, recommends that is they're always saying like, oh, it will give you the latest patch level updates and you will be always on the latest and most secure version. The thing is, with the accidental changes that might happen, it might also give you unstable builds or non-reproducible builds, because if you build something yesterday and then somebody released a transitive dependency, for example, today, and you build again, things might be different. So it might be very hard to figure out bugs or just get a stable build. Because of that, the Java ecosystem learned it a long time ago and is pretty strict about not using version ranges. Other ecosystems are more flexible about version ranges. Is anybody thinking that version ranges are a good idea? Okay, okay, 2, okay. Yeah, I feel like they make it a lot trickier, and with things like Dependabot, it should be very easy to keep current. I understand that previously, before Dependabot, it was very hard to keep up to date all the time, but if the Dependabot just sends me the pull request and I can quickly merge, and it has run through the testing and it's better now, I think that's, for me at least, a saner approach. Who thinks that experimental API endpoints, for example, are okay? Okay, because that is another like escape hatch that some are using, that they mark an API as experimental and then they still can have breaking changes without needing a new major version. It just makes it a bit trickier to understand what is actually breaking and not breaking anymore. We are also doing that we have some API endpoints where we are not sure if they're right or if we need to change them, and we want to have the right to not wait for a new major version to fix that. But it does increase the complexity about what is in a version, and you need to read the release notes more carefully then. Who thinks that a UI change can be a breaking change? Okay, you're not a UI audience. Because if I'm going to a front-end conference, then everybody would say like, yes, UI changes can totally be breaking. But that again comes back to the question like, what is the API? Is it for the end user, and a totally different API is kind of like a breaking change that should get its own major version number? Or is that more like an implementation detail that the UI is totally different? What happens before I reach 1.0 in semantic versioning? So I have version 0 point whatever. What do we have there? You can do whatever you want. I always call it the Wild West. There you can do any breaking changes, and you can do really whatever you want because it's just not defined. Before 1.0, semantic versioning doesn't give you any guarantees. So it's, yeah, like the Wild West. Something I recently ran into in our internal applications, that String Boot tries to do semantic versioning to some degree, but not always. So we recently had in a minor version a breaking change around some SemVer stuff. And they officially say that semantic versioning is too strict or too rigid for them, so they will try to adhere to it. But sometimes there can be things that might not adhere to semantic versioning exactly. That's something I ran into recently. Who knows Kubernetes? Because Kubernetes has a huge API surface, and what they are doing is they have something they provide. If they want to remove something, they have to provide a replacement. They deprecate it. They have a rolling forward upgrading strategy, and only then can you remove an API. But that's why Kubernetes doesn't have version 25 by now, but is still on a much lower version, major version number, because they have this upgrading strategy, and if you run through all the versions of Kubernetes, they should take care of those breaking changes, and that's why for them that those are not really breaking changes, but that's their upgrading strategy, for example. Those of you who have used Terraform in the past, they were on 0 point something for a very long time. They did provide enterprise support and had breaking changes at the same time, which created a kind of a weird ecosystem. On the other hand, who is ever upgrading Terraform? Once you start using it, normally you're just sticking to that version. Anybody still using Ansible? They have created the weirdest ecosystem, and I can only describe it as mayhem, because they have version 2, 3, and 4, and they're all trying to do different things, and you really don't want to get into that because they, their versioning is very weird by now. They have a full blog post describing how they try to do versioning. One of the other fun examples is, for example, MySQL. If anybody also uses that, you remember that there were a lot of 5.x versions, and at some point they jumped to 8. And these here were almost or pretty much major versions. And I think there were two reasons for that. First, I think Sun, when it was still Sun, they tried to do version 6.0, and then when it was bought by Oracle, they gave up on that. 7.0 should have been some clustering thing that also never saw the light of day, and then they went straight to 8. That's why they jumped these version numbers here. And I've heard at least a rumor before that if you do a major version number at Oracle, you need officially to have legal sign off on that, and to avoid that, they kept doing minor versions here, even though they were like majors. It was more like a legal hack, allegedly. Alternatives to semantic versioning, is anybody still using calendar versioning? It used to be more popular. Ubuntu is doing that, you know, when you have 2004, which is April 2020. That's the version when it came out, and it's kind of like clear when it came out and how old the version is. But they are very much on those time-based release trains. It also used to be a much more common thing. So MongoDB used it for a long time, Node.js used it for a while, Linux used it a while ago, but it's like that Gallic little village that is shrinking because calendar versioning is not as popular as it used to be. Semantic versioning seems to be the new thing that everybody wants. Anybody using Git hashes for their versions? I mean, internally it's fine, but externally, only if you hate your users, you're doing that. So yeah, we're all doing semantic versioning one way or another, hopefully the right way, and we can all agree on that. And I think that can lead to a heated discussion. Any questions or points anybody wants to make? Yes?
Okay, when we shouldn't increase the version?
When you shouldn't increase the version. So I think that's, to some degree, that's almost like a marketing thing at some point, because some people say like, oh, versions are cheap, like just keep increasing them. It's like the browsers which have reached, Chrome is at 100, whatever by now. So it's a cheap operation, you can just do it, you signal that something is breaking, but it shouldn't be a big deal. And for others, it's more like either a marketing opportunity or maybe also for historic reasons, major version changes were very painful, and then they're very cautious because it always signals trouble to their users, so they are trying to avoid that. And I think there is no easy solution to that. In theory, it's just like, once the API changes, that's a major version number, and for some it's like, oh, it's an everyday operation and you just increase as needed. And for others, it's more like a big thing. And I don't think there is an easy solution to that, or semantic versioning itself also doesn't say anything about that. That's more like how you treat it. Anything else? Yeah, please.
Do you know some practices for isolating changes that would require a minor or major change of version? Sometimes it gets like altogether.
Yes, so the isolating changes, I think depending on the system you're using, from what I know, for example, even Spring and Spring Boot only do that manually and they don't have an automated way to do that. They have integration tests to check for breaking changes. If you want to structure it differently, yeah, you could have a lot of packages, but then it's just, you just split it up into smaller parts and then you have more breaking changes there. I feel like the NPM ecosystem is very strongly on that, where 3 lines of code are their own package. And then you can increase that. So it's kind of like more tightly wrapped. I'm not sure that will necessarily make it easier, because rather than 5 dependencies, you have 500 dependencies then. And I think you're just shifting the pain around. Because the breaking change is not going away, it's just like when will it hit you and how many at a time. But it's just like, do you have more pain at one time, or do you have it spread out more? So I don't think it's more of an organizational thing, what makes sense for you or your users, but I don't think there is a general answer to that. Sure. Yes, please. So the question was, if it was too quiet, if we have any tools in our CI to actually do semantic versioning. No, so for us it's also integration tests. So we have the integration test suite, and it will just run and will tell us against the REST API something changed. But like I said, for us the REST API is sacred. Internal APIs are a different thing, so there we don't actually apply that. And no, it's also a manual process where we try to take care of not doing bad stuff, but there were 1 or 2 changes around security where people were using something, I don't know, some Kerberos authentication in a way that we didn't want that, and it was actually adding a security issue. And that didn't trigger a major version for all our products, but we just fixed it in a minor version then. There are release notes, but who reads release notes? Anything else? No? Enjoy lunch. Thanks a lot. If you have more stuff, I have stickers. And, well, happy to answer anything else. Thank you.